It's really my honor to have these two wonderful guests. And I'm just going to give a short introduction so we can really get right into the conversation. The two authors of these books that you saw outside, The Constitution Demands It, from Ron Fein, and The Case for Impeaching Trump by former Congresswoman Holtzman. Congresswoman Holtzman was a former member of the House of Representatives. As a Democrat, she represented New York's 16th congressional district for 4 terms, and she was the first woman to hold office of New York City Comptroller, first woman to serve as District Attorney of Kings County. She was also, and this key to this story today and to her book, she was a member of the Judiciary Committee in 1974, convening over Nixon and Watergate. And if you listen to any stories about the Watergate hearings, she was a key member of that pivotal committee. Then after the Watergate scandal, Holtzman authored a bill that authorized the independent counsel to be appointed. And then the law that passed was the basis for the independent counsel statute that was so key in so many other events in the 80s and 90s. Ron Fein is the legal director for Free Speech for People. He previously served as assistant regional counsel for the US EPA in New England and received the EPA's National Gold Medal for exceptional service. He was supervised the office's Clean Air Act practice. He previously clerked for Kermit Lipez of the First Circuit and Douglas Woodlock of the United States District Court of the District of Massachusetts. And he received summa cum laude degree from Harvard College and graduated from Stanford Law School. And he and I have actually worked very closely together early on in 2017 on the question of emoluments litigation, and co-authored several different op-eds and talked about the investigation using impeachment and civil proceedings to do what we thought would be helpful for finding out more about President Trump's financial records. That would have been really important litigation if Mueller had not been appointed. Fortunately, we've discovered a lot about the civil litigation system, but it was really a delight to work with him on that. So without further ado, we're going to have Congresswoman Holtzman talk for a few minutes, and then Ron Fein, and then we'll have a conversation and then open it up to the rest of you. Great.
Thank you. I'm going to speak. If you're tethered, it's not a good thing. Sorry, I'm going to try to speak from here, just so I can take a brief look at my notes from time to time. Thank you very much, Professor, and thank you, Ron, and thanks to all of you for coming. I know we're in serious competition with Michael Cohen, and I appreciate your coming here because what we're going to be talking about is something of vital importance to the country. The elevator speech about impeachment, which is what I'm giving you, doesn't do justice to the complexity and the importance of the subject. When the framers got together in Philadelphia and they put together the structure of our government, they were really worried about a runaway president. And they debated whether or not there should be an impeachment clause. What were they going to do with a president who threatened our democracy? Some people said, oh, well, what do we need to worry about impeachment, removal of a president? We have election every 4 years. That'll take care of it. Others said a president can do really great damage during the time that the president is in office, so we've got to do something to take care of that right away. So the people who said, let's wait for 4 years, let's wait for elections, lost. We had an impeachment clause, because the framers were terrified about a runaway rogue president. Just briefly, what were the grounds? One was treason. They were very worried about a president who became somehow entangled with a foreign government. That was clearly an issue, and they talked about it in several ways, not only with regard to impeachment, but also with regard to emoluments. A very strange term. But the grounds that they had were treason, which is defined in the Constitution, bribery, which we pretty well understand. I mean, we may not understand the exact circumference, configuration of the term, but we pretty well get what it means. Payment of people in office, or payment by people in office for someone else in office to do some function. The third term is pretty obscure. Treason is defined, bribery is understood. The third ground for impeachment is high crimes and misdemeanors. What does that mean? Nobody 100% knows, because it really is a term that derives from ancient British history, something we didn't study in my 3 years at Harvard Law School. But in any case, when we were doing the impeachment proceedings against Richard Nixon, we spent a lot of time trying to understand what a high crime and misdemeanor was. And ultimately, the committee voted, after studying very carefully the legal precedents and the historical precedents, that number one, a high crime and misdemeanor does not mean a crime. The 3 articles of impeachment against Richard Nixon did not mention the violation of any single section of the United States Code. It did not claim, none of those articles claimed that he broke the law. That was not what a high crime and misdemeanor is about. It's not the replacement for a prosecutor. High really means a person in high office. It doesn't mean the kind of crime that you're committing, although in a way it does relate to that. So the committee, and briefly, we could talk about it in questions. Briefly, the meaning is, in my judgment, and if you look at the articles of impeachment against Richard Nixon, which is the only impeachment process that ever worked in this country, the definition would be an egregious abuse, misuse of power that threatens the democracy or that invades the liberties of the American people. That would be a pretty good working definition. Not a crime, definitely. The Nixon impeachment also offers us a roadmap. I want to say a lot of people may remember the Clinton impeachment. I'm not sure anybody in this room does, as you're all too young. But the Clinton impeachment was a disaster. It was totally partisan. The Republicans who brought it on a totally partisan basis were soundly defeated at the polls. In the next election, Clinton soared through it. That's what most people think. Impeachment backfires. Let's just wait to the next election. And they forget what happened to Nixon. The Nixon impeachment was not prompted by by any political person, not a special prosecutor, not the Democrats, not the Republicans. It was prompted by the American people when Nixon had the special prosecutor fired, Archibald Cox, because he was trying to get White House tapes that could incriminate Nixon. And the American people said, you know what? We're not a banana republic. The president can't stop a prosecutor from doing what the prosecutor had to do, which is to recover the evidence. And so they flooded Washington with telegrams and phone calls. We didn't have internet then. And flooded district offices with their presence, demanding that Congress take action. This was a time when both the Senate and the House were controlled by the Democrats, but nobody wanted to go for impeachment until the American people forced it. When we started the impeachment, we didn't take a head count, either in the committee or in the House, and we didn't even take a head count in the Senate. Nobody, in fact, even knew what impeachment was. Nobody had studied it in law school, and we knew way back, Andrew Johnson, there was a bad impeachment, highly criticized by the press, by the historians, by scholars. That was the only precedent we had, and we knew we weren't going to follow that, and we didn't want to do another Andrew Johnson. The result was we had a bipartisan process, fair, thorough, procedurally fair to the president. And we came up with 3 articles of impeachment. We had 30% of the Republicans supporting it, as well as every single Democrat, including extremely conservative Southern Democrats, who probably had districts that were even more supportive of Nixon than some of the Republican districts. And the grounds, I'm just going to mention some of those grounds because they're going to resonate. You're going to hear echoes up to today from them. First ground, Nixon ordered, the first ground was obstructing, impeding, interfering with an investigation by the special prosecutor into the Watergate break-in. By the way, the Watergate break-in was a physical break-in into the Democratic National Committee. We still don't know what they were looking for, but they were trying to interfere with the upcoming election. Sound familiar? Okay. But Nixon, just almost day one, I think maybe it was day 2 or 3, called his top staff in and said, you get the CIA to stop the FBI investigation. And that was done. Fast forward to today. One of the charges that was reported in the press was that Trump called in the head of the CIA, Michael Pompeo, and called in the head of the Directorate of National Intelligence and said, I want you to get James Comey to stop the investigation into Michael Flynn and into Russia. I'm not saying it's exactly the same, but similar. Second thing, there were many, many charges against Nixon. I'm just going to go to the ones that I think are most relevant. Dangling pardons. Richard Nixon authorized pardons to be offered to the Watergate burglars to keep them from talking about the involvement of higher-ups. That was one of the grounds for the articles of impeachment against Richard Nixon. We know that Trump was reported to have done this with regard to Michael Flynn and possibly others, and we heard him ourselves tweeting about Manafort, be strong, and I'm not taking a pardon off the table. Okay. And then, of course, Nixon fired the head of the special prosecutor, the head of the investigation against him, and we know that Trump fired Comey. I'm sure my time is beginning to run out, so I just want to say this, that the roadmap that's offered by Watergate and the Nixon impeachment process is one that we need to pay very careful attention to today. As I said, it was bipartisan. In fact, the Democrats appointed a Republican as the counsel for the impeachment inquiry. Think about that. It was an effort to try to assure the American people this process was not going to be a gotcha process, a political process, but was going to be as fair as possible. Why? Because it wasn't going to work. We knew that. There would never be an impeachment if the American people saw it as a partisan effort to overturn an election. It wasn't going to work. So we had to bend over backwards to get the evidence and to do it in the right way. In my opinion, what has to be done now is the House needs to start undertaking serious investigations into areas that could produce evidence that would match what we had in Watergate. I gave you some indications of some of the areas. If the evidence is there, then impeachment proceedings should start. We shouldn't shy away from them. We shouldn't say the election's coming. We need to protect the democracy now. That's what the framers had in mind when they added the impeachment clause to the Constitution, and it's our responsibility, if we're going to keep this democracy, to use it if we can and when these circumstances are appropriate. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Ron Fein, the legal director of Free Speech for People. We're a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization. And let me first thank Professor Shugerman and Congresswoman Holtzman and Fordham for hosting this important discussion. Let me also say to the law students out there that I know most of you are dyed-in-the-wool New Yorkers, but if you are interested in either coming to do a summer internship in Boston, where our legal office is located, or would be interested in remote work, we may have some opportunities, so you can come talk to me afterwards. Let me begin by saying that I agree with 98% of what Representative Holtzman just said. So if over the course of today's discussion some differences emerge, please take it in the context of that broad agreement. I want to make 3 main points right now, which are set forth in much greater detail in our book, The Constitution Demands It, written by myself, John Bonifaz, and Ben Clements, and which is conveniently available for sale up front, with all proceeds going to support our organization's efforts. The 3 points I want to make are, 1, that we have the legal basis to start an impeachment inquiry now. 2, that we should, that it is in the national interest for the House to begin an impeachment inquiry. And 3, that it should be explicitly framed as an impeachment inquiry. So the first point that we have the legal basis to initiate an impeachment inquiry begins with what Representative Holtzman said, which is that it is virtually unanimously agreed by any serious individual who has studied the Constitution or the history of Congress's own impeachments, by which I include not only the presidential impeachments, but also judges and other federal officials who've been impeached. There have been 19 officials impeached over the course of our history, and some 60 impeachment investigations in total, that impeachable offenses need not be crimes. That's not in serious dispute. Alan Dershowitz disputes it, but it's not in serious dispute. The evidence for Trump having committed impeachable offenses, we lay out 8 in the book, plus a chapter on others that were emerging at the time that we finished our book, of which 2 more have ripened, and 1 is under discussion just this morning by Michael Cohen, talking about secret hush money payments to influence the election. They include the gamut. Some of them do overlap with criminal offenses. Some of them are within the scope of Special Counsel Mueller's investigation, and there are facts yet to be developed. Others don't violate any criminal statute at all. Let me give you an example. Emoluments. So emoluments, I'm sure the law students have now learned it in con law in a way that it wasn't taught in the past, but the Constitution explicitly prohibits the president from taking payments from foreign governments, from supplicants in state governments, and from enriching himself from the federal treasury. And from day 1 of this presidency, Trump, through his businesses, has been violating all of those provisions. These were identified specifically by the framers as impeachable offenses. The record is fairly clear, and one of the greatest statements came from the Virginia ratifying convention, where Virginia was very closely divided on whether to ratify the Constitution at all. And George Mason, who was one of the opponents of the Constitution, said, one of the dangers is that the president might be in foreign pay. And Edmund Randolph, who was the governor of Virginia, and later became George Washington's first attorney general, answered, if discovered, he may be impeached. Now, the Virginia ratifying convention barely ratified the Constitution, so it's not hard to imagine that this was a critical piece of information that soothed the delegates to that convention, and of course, without Virginia, we would have had no Constitution. So emoluments is just one example of a whole set of impeachable offenses that don't violate any criminal provision, but are nonetheless impeachable, that we know either from similar framing history, from the history of how Congress has, over the course of 2+ centuries, impeached officials, from comments by Supreme Court justices that a certain offense would be an impeachable offense if it were committed. So the evidence for starting the impeachment inquiry is already there. We don't need to wait for some additional piece of information to come in to start the inquiry. And that's my second point about starting the inquiry. Impeachment is a 3-phase process. 2 of the phases are specified by the Constitution, but there's a preliminary phase, not required by the Constitution, but which the House has done in 100% of the impeachments that it's done over 2+ centuries. So the second and third steps, the ones in the Constitution, are that the House has to take a vote to impeach the president by a majority, and then there's a trial in the Senate. But there's a first step, which is what Representative Holtzman mentioned, which is an impeachment inquiry that a committee of the House conducts. In the modern era, it's always the Judiciary Committee of the House. And this inquiry aims to gather evidence. The Judiciary Committee can subpoena witnesses, can subpoena documents, and it can receive information or debate on whether a certain offense is impeachable or not. It could hear testimony from constitutional scholars, develop legal analyses. And starting the inquiry is not a commitment to necessarily voting to impeach. It's starting the inquiry. In the case of Nixon, the impeachment inquiry started on October 30th, 1973. Now, there was a special prosecutor had just been fired, and one was just about to be appointed. They didn't have anything from the special prosecutor at that point. If I'm not mistaken, it wasn't until March of 1974 that the Judiciary Committee received anything from the special prosecutor in the Nixon case. So when you hear people say, well, we have to wait for the Mueller report before the Judiciary Committee can even start the inquiry, that's not consistent with the Nixon history. And in fact, a lot of what the impeachment inquiry did at first was preliminary work, preparatory work, staffing up, hiring lawyers, producing a very well-regarded legal analysis on the constitutional grounds for presidential impeachment. And that's what we're recommending should start now. No one is seriously suggesting that the House is ready to take a final floor vote on articles of impeachment today. But I do think that the House Judiciary Committee is ready to start an inquiry. It may not be bipartisan at first. And in fact, the Judiciary Committee's very first vote on its first day of its impeachment inquiry in October 1973 divided along party lines, a procedural question as to subpoena power. But by the end of the process, it was bipartisan. And the last point I want to make is that the impeachment inquiry should be framed as an impeachment inquiry. And there's a very good reason for this, articulated by another former member of Congress, David Jolly, who is a several-term Republican congressman from Florida. And we're in a different situation than 1973 and 1974. In 1973 and 74, there was the benefit of a several-month hearings by the Senate Watergate Committee, which was not in the framework of an impeachment investigation. It was just sort of oversight, fact-finding hearings. We don't have that. And that's in large part because the House delayed for 2 years in investigating those of Trump's offenses that were already fairly apparent from the public record. But now, seeing where we are right now, Representative Jolly made the following point. He said, imagine two scenarios. One scenario is that the House starts with just general oversight hearings, perhaps like the one that we saw this morning with Michael Cohen, like the ones that President Obama and his officials received, like the ones that President George W. Bush and his officials received. The American public will see this as part of the normal give and take of divided government, where when you have a president and Congress from different parties, there are oversight hearings, and it will be understood as business as usual. On the other hand, if the House Judiciary Committee deliberately sets it up as an impeachment inquiry, it sends the message that this is not a normal situation. This is a president who has deliberately compromised his own fitness for office, who's lied about matters of national security, and who deserves to be treated as such. And that will help prepare the American public for the steps that will follow. We don't have time to spend a year or 2 years on preliminary hearings before even raising the question of impeachment. The question is live now. So we need to start the impeachment inquiry and call it for what it is. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Terrific. So there's a lot on the table, and I think a lot of good arguments, and there's much that I agree with, but I'm going to take a slightly different, and just to make some brief points. And this isn't playing devil's advocate. I've written a lot about the various crimes and the grounds for impeachment in various respects. But taking a step back, I think it's really important to recognize the risks of impeaching, especially impeaching too quickly. Now, one historical observation is that we talked a little bit about past impeachments, but one of the dangers we have to recognize, and I think this is highlighted by this morning, is that the Democrats so far are doing a terrible job in the House at this. Right? So if you look at Whitaker, if you looked at Whitaker's committee testimony before the House Judiciary, or if you watched this morning, most of the Democrats who engaged in the hearings on their own were terrible. Cummings did a good job this morning. After Cummings, one Democrat after another wasted their 5 minutes. Those committees were not effective at doing the job of informing or persuading the public. If we think that we want to rely on the House with impeachment investigation and having a committee questioning that was going to move the ball forward with the public, I think that's wishful thinking, right? The Democrats have to dramatically change their strategy. They have to learn from their disaster of their inability to ask Whitaker effective questions or to think like prosecutors, or the House Oversight Committee, as good as Cummings was in his 5 minutes, he did not seem to have coordinated the House Democrats in the House Oversight Committee to be effective at doing what their job is, right? So what's the risk? So I would say let's take a step back. The best case scenario for the American Republic is that Trump runs for re-election and loses with the American voters in November of 2020. that has to be a moment of redemption for American voters. Not that they're saved by Robert Mueller, not that they're saved by the House vote to impeach and the Senate to remove, because that will, that scenario, if there's a scenario in which Trump would have won re-election in 2020, but for the intervention of a number of elected officials, that narrative is not going to be very helpful for the country moving forward, right? If Trump has enough support to win, but was removed, or if people, or I'll say something else, if there's a perception that Trump, a wrong perception, but a perception nevertheless, that Trump was removed from office because Republican elites and the Democrat Party, as they say, the TIC gets lost in the way that the Democrats get mentioned in the media. But if there's a sense that the deep state and the bureaucrats and the elites stole Trump from the base without a vote, I think that might actually be worse for the Republic. Now, what's the risk? I mean, the huge risk is Trump gets reelected. I mean, my perspective is that the country has been damaged in many ways by these 2.5 years of Trump being in office, but there's not irreparable harm. Yeah, there is harm to individuals, but there's nothing in these 4 years that we can't resolve that is irreparable. A second term, I think, when you start to getting to irreparable damage. So the risk has to be, what if Trump gets reelected and isn't important for impeachment or removal? I think that's true, but I still think there are dangers in having a removal that has the perception of taking Trump out of office when he might have been reelected. So the best case scenario is actually Trump running for reelection and losing. But what are the risks of, let's talk about the risks of having an impeachment that moves right now. Okay, so I talked first of all about, I think, moving too quickly and relying on the Democrats in the House to do a good job. So far, they haven't demonstrated that they can do this job themselves. So one point is, it's really important to wait for the Mueller report, right? Mueller and his team are surely going to have done a better, more thorough job than what can happen in 5-minute increments with the House committee. And more generally, I think that there's a real concern that, even I think that there's some better methods of doing it, like having outside counsel come in and ask the questions. There's still questions about that effectiveness. So I think the other question is, what happens with an impeachment that moves too quickly, or an impeachment that is perceived to be partisan? And we have an historic reference point in many of our own lifetimes. I mean, maybe not my students, but I was a law student during the Clinton impeachment of 1998 House vote and the 1999 Senate removal hearings. Guess what happened after the House voted to impeach Clinton? Remarkably, the Democrats won more seats in the November 1998 elections. Now, there are a number of reasons why this happened, but it's actually pretty remarkable for an incumbent president's party to gain seats, especially in a second term in office. That's a key time where the party in power in the White House loses seats in Congress. Why did that happen? It's because the Republicans engaged in factually and perceived to be a partisan-driven impeachment vote. And it was a partisan impeachment vote. Now, at the time I said Clinton should have been removed from office, right? At the time, I actually said, as a liberal law student, I actually felt like Clinton had committed high crimes and misdemeanors in terms of the fiduciary responsibility in his office. But nevertheless, it was also, Clinton may have committed high crimes and misdemeanors as president, and yet it was also a highly partisan, manipulated impeachment hearing. The real risk with pushing too hard right now is it will consolidate Trump's base if it moves too quickly, and if it's botched or done in a partisan and not in a very professional way, it will also be perceived by moderates and independents as being a waste, as being driven by partisanship. And so to that extent, I think it's really important that someone who's perceived to be relatively less partisan, Robert Mueller, a Republican, has time to produce a report, and that Democrats wait. And I actually think it's important not to do what I agree with Ron's main points, that there is a legal basis to impeach. And a second point is we should start now. But the third point is that we should frame this as impeachment. And I strongly disagree with that third point. I think it's important not to frame this as impeachment. I think it's key to actually have the House do these subpoenas, have these committee hearings, be better at them, but make sure it's not explicitly framed as impeachment hearings, but as fact-finding. And that fact-finding is going to be far better and far more clear with a much stronger basis factually for having those follow-up questions if we're patient. There is time for Mueller's report to be made public. I used to be a skeptic of Bill Barr, but I think we have time to give Bill Barr the credit that he will release a report in some fair extent to the public. That's going to happen soon enough. If we can wait to March, April, even May, there's still time for the House to follow up over the summer and to have the Senate then vote on removal sometime next fall. That's the window, 2019. But once we turn the page to 2020, then the window's closed. Because at that point, you'll have a full-blown set of candidates running for the Democratic primary. And at that point, I think it backfires. So my point is, it's too soon to frame it as impeachment now, and that at a certain point that window closes, but there is a sufficient window between the summer of 2019 and the fall of 2019 to have a full House impeachment and Senate removal, and I think we should be patient enough to wait for that window. So those are my thoughts. Great. So I think there maybe is room for conversation, and then we should open it up to students' questions.
Okay, well, I think you made the point that basically I was making, which is that we shouldn't start impeachment now, but that we should definitely start
Oh, here, why don't we-
Well, the microphone isn't working, so I don't know.
now.
Is it? Okay. That the point that I was making, maybe I didn't make it clearly enough, is that we shouldn't do impeachment now, but we should do the investigations now. I think that that's vital. And I also think that the investigations have to be done in a strategic way. That's also very important. We don't have all the time in the world. And so if we want to investigate Donald Trump's, oh great. So if we want to investigate Donald Trump's connections, alleged connections with organized crime 20 years ago, great, but that will not lead to impeachment. What needs to be done is to investigate the areas, certainly the ones that were grounds for the articles of impeachment against Richard Nixon. No one can argue if you can prove that the president actually communicated pardons to Flynn, or if you can prove that the president actually told the head of the CIA to call Comey and tell him to stop the investigation. Those are things that have to be proven. It may be that Mueller knows it, but we don't know whether that information is ever going to come out. You can be confident in Barr. I don't want to be confident in anybody. I want to make sure that the House gets those facts. So what I believe needs to be done is that the House should begin immediately to do targeted and strategic investigations, focusing first and primarily on seeing whether they can prove the grounds that were used to impeach Richard Nixon, because that becomes a very, very difficult thing to fight off. Oh, you're doing something that's never been done. Oh, you're just treating him, worse than anybody else. No, you have that example. So that would be my statement. I also think that the idea, though, that the removal from office is bad is wrong, because you're falling into, with all due respect, Professor, the trap of people who get stuck in the Clinton impeachment. There was an impeachment 20 years before that. You weren't there then, but that impeachment worked. What happened was, and I think what's really important, so you say, well, people will get upset and consolidate the base. Think about the Nixon impeachment from this point of view. The break-in took place in June 72. The cover-up took place because the election was going to be held that November, 1972. The cover-up was so effective that Nixon was reelected, and he was reelected with one of the largest landslide elections in American history. It wasn't like Donald Trump squeaked through. Nixon lost only one state, and he clearly won the Electoral College. So when the American people said, we want impeachment, and when the American people supported the results of impeachment, people had to change their minds. That's a pretty impressive thing. Americans had to change their minds. Most of them had voted for him overwhelmingly. They had to change their minds because, and they did so, because of a process that was fair, a process that was nonpartisan, a process that gave deference to the president, and no name calling. I think this was what we're seeing in some of these hearings. No name calling, certainly not by the chair. And so the American people bought into something because they recognized the danger he presented to the society. That will only happen if we follow the roadmap, the blueprint of the Nixon Impeachment Inquiry. That is what I think is critical here, and not get hung up. And by the way, even though we didn't start this with the idea that this was going to have a good political effect, in fact, we didn't even know whether there was going to be an impeachment as a result, since none of us, when we first started, even knew what an impeachment was. Maybe some people did, but I for sure didn't, and I know there were many other members of the committee that didn't. So I think that to worry about the politics of this is wrong, except to the extent, but the politics worked out. I just want to mention that. Because when we finished our impeachment inquiry and voted 3 articles of impeachment, and Nixon resigned because he knew he was going to be removed from office, there's no question about that. What happened in the polls in that election? I mean, that was the biggest defeat for the Republicans, I think, in any election, even more so than in just the last one. And it wasn't the intention, but it was the result, because people saw the evidence. They said, the Republicans stood up for Nixon, and they wanted to change. So I don't know that we can predict the politics. Remember, who predicted that Trump would win? I don't think sitting here today we can say what's going to be the political result. We can look at history and we can say, you were able to change the minds of a majority of the American people who voted for Nixon in 1972 as a result of the impeachment inquiry that was done in a fair way. If we can imitate that, follow that as a model, then I think we can. I think the evidence is there. I certainly agree with Ron Fein. There's a legal basis to start an impeachment. The problem is that people will get so caught up in the word impeachment that they will fail to look at the facts. We need to educate the American people about the facts, and we don't have all of the facts yet. That's it.
Thanks. I just want to add a few points, and then maybe soon we'll go to audience questions. The issue with the timing and the Mueller report is that no one knows outside of the special counsel's office when that report is coming. And we keep seeing rumors that it might be coming soon. We don't even know what the "it" is. Will it simply be a summary of indictments issued? Will it be, people are expecting something that arose under a former statute, which is in 1998, the Ken Starr issued a report under a special counsel statute that no longer exists. That was a 500-something page description of every one of President Clinton's misdeeds, criminal or not, impeachable or not. That's not, we don't have that statute anymore. We're operating under a different legal framework for special counsel Mueller. He's operating under regulations that require him to provide possibly much less information to the Attorney General, to Congress, or to the public. So we don't know when he's going to finish. You may remember that Donald Trump's lawyer was originally saying he'd be done by Thanksgiving of 2017. And we don't know what it is he's going to produce at the end. We also know that his appointment focuses on just 2 areas. He's focused on Russian efforts to influence the 2016 election, which is both a criminal investigation and also a counterintelligence investigation, and obstruction of justice or other crimes that arose from that. There are a host of things that are not part of Mueller's investigation. I mean, obviously, emoluments. If Trump is being paid off by the Saudis through hotel stays here in Manhattan, and that's influencing foreign policy, that's not part of Mueller's investigation because he's focused on those limited areas. Trump directing law enforcement to harass his enemies list, we have no reason to think that that's part of Mueller's investigation. It doesn't seem to be within the scope of his appointment, but as we saw with President Nixon, that can be part of a case for impeachment. I think that the Nixon model is a very good starting point. I don't think we need to stick to it slavishly, but it provides a useful starting point. And we should think about how is this time the same as 1973, 1974, and how is this era different? And where necessary, use a different model if it's more suited to the times. The last thing I want to say to wrap up is I agree with Representative Holtzman that no one can accurately predict the politics, and everybody who predicted the 2016 election would come out the way it did, stand up right now and show me the receipts that you actually predicted it that way, because I think all the conventional wisdom is wrong. But what I will say is this: I think a lot of people, and let me reemphasize that ours is a nonpartisan effort, so our goal, when I say our, I mean Free Speech for People, is not to help or hurt the Democrats or the Republicans in the 2020 election. That's not our goal here. But to the extent that people are concerned about the politics, let's talk for a moment about the Clinton impeachment, because I think people misremember what happened. 1998, the Republicans won the House. 2000, the Republicans won the House and the presidency. 2002, the Republicans won the House. 2004, the Republicans won the House and the presidency. It was not until 2006 that the Democrats won the House. So I don't think the Republicans suffered that much from the Clinton impeachment. My purpose here is not to defend Bill Clinton by any means, nor to suggest that these political considerations should be at the heart of it. But I think it's important to bear in mind that was a different era. I mean, as Jed pointed out, many law students today barely remember that, if at all. We're in 2019 now. The lessons of 1998 are a different category. The lessons of 1974 are even older. And we're moving at internet speed or faster in the Trump era. There's some things where I've seen on Twitter, somebody will point out something that you say, oh, I remember that happening. Was that like a year ago? And it was last week, because the times are moving very quickly. And I think the idea of waiting an indefinite amount of time for a special counsel report that's on a narrow subset of potentially impeachable offenses before even starting the process. I'm not saying before completing the process. Before even starting the process, I think is a mistake.
Great, terrific. Let's open it up. Yeah, let's get the microphone moving. Yeah,
There's also one in the aisle.
Great, let's start here. Tell us your name first.
My name is Mike. I was just wondering, I don't know how much this long it's going to take up for the American people to stand up around this country and demand that he's being basically removed from the White House. Somebody just said something about that if we impeach him, that it would backfire on the Democrats and that he may win in 2020. 30% does not control this country. We do. 6,500,000 that voted for Hillary Clinton. So as an American, I'm disgusted. I'm sad that I feel that I have to live in Nazi Germany. All of our rights, we have kids in concentration camps, and this man is a Russian spy. The Republicans will never leave this man. They're like glued to him like glue. So I just think that organizations like MoveOn.org, the Women's March, we need to rise up, people. Wake up, people. Everybody in this room. We are living in Nazi Germany, 1939. This man must be removed now.
How about right to your right, Professor Zapersky?
I'm very good friends with Professor Shugerman. And one of my concerns, though, is that his thinking was so deeply political, and my question for Representative Holtzman is sort of an ethical question. I mean, if you believed Professor Shugerman's political arguments, would you still think there was an obligation to do it anyway, because it's a fiduciary duty of somebody in Congress? Is that your understanding of the nature of the duty? So that's one question, but the second question is also to you, and it comes in a way from the other side. So high crimes and misdemeanors, I mean, when you were a member of Congress, we lived in an era where students who went to law school did not learn textualism as the way to understand everything. It was a completely different era about how the Constitution really needs to be understood. Ironically, yours is more historicist than the current era, in my opinion. Our students learn they really need to look at those words. Being told by a whole bunch of historians or academics or politicians that everybody agrees that high crimes and misdemeanors doesn't really mean crimes. Our students are told today to reject that. And you really need to look at the language. So I just wondered if you would address both of those questions.
Of course you have to look at the language, but what does the language mean? The term is not crime. The word crime is modified by an adjective high. You can't read the word crime by itself. This is a little bit like Scalia in the Heller case, where he said, did the same kind of thing. Well, we don't have to look at the first part of the Second Amendment. We'll just look at the second part of the Second Amendment. You can't do that. You have to look at what the word means. It's not just the word crime. It's the word high crime. And if you look at its historical meaning, you will see that it was never limited to simply criminal acts. But even more important than the history, more important, I would say, than the history, is in fact how Congress interpreted it. And the only successful interpretation was during the Nixon impeachment and the 3 articles of impeachment that were voted, which have withstood the test of time. And nobody has criticized, except some far, I don't even know what their political views are, left or right or green or blue, but aside from a lunatic fringe, nobody has attacked that result. So that's a pretty important precedent. It's a little bit like, McCulloch versus Maryland. It stands right out there. So the student shouldn't just get caught up in the word, one word or another word. You have to read the whole phrase, and you have to look at how it's been interpreted in the one clear interpretation that has withstood the test of time. Now, your first question is an interesting question. Should you vote for impeachment if you think it's a politically right thing to do, but legally wrong?
The other
I don't
way
think
around.
so.
The other way
Or
around. If
if it's legally right and politically wrong, I don't know how you could come to that conclusion. Well, I guess that could happen. You don't have a fiduciary duty. Your duty is, as a member of Congress, is no fiduciary responsibility. You're not committing any kind of tortious act if you vote for something because it's politically right or wrong or harmful or not harmful. Part of, I think, the calculus, well, first of all, going back again to my experience in the House Judiciary Committee, I don't think that anybody knew when we voted on the House Judiciary Committee, I don't think that anybody really knew what the public reaction was going to be. I don't think so. And I think the public reaction was in part a result because people were very sincerely trying to express their views. We didn't do factual hearings. No, the hearings we had were the debate on the articles. Should there be impeachment? Shouldn't there be impeachment? And was there sufficient evidence to warrant it? And I think the public was very impressed by the sincerity, by the demeanor, by the fairness of the argumentation. I don't know that the most American people could follow all the nuances of the points we were making. I think it's, so I don't know that you can predict the political outcome. I was trying to fence with this professor to my right, and I'm fencing with you to my left. I don't know that you can tell the political outcome. And I think what happened with the House Judiciary Committee was that because the stakes were so high, because I think people, definitely the Democrats, felt that Nixon was such a danger to the society, that they knew unless they did it the right way, there wasn't even a prayer that we would get it through. So I think that's what people did. They just said, well, okay, let's look for the evidence, let's get the evidence out there and do it the right way. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I'm trying.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. I just want to add on briefly, with respect to the first question, well, obviously I don't have the position that Representative Holtzman has of having been on the inside. Fiduciary duty or not, the members of Congress do take an oath to uphold and protect the Constitution. And I think that means that they need to put the interests of the Constitution and the United States as they understand it. I mean, if they legitimately come to the conclusion that the president has not committed high crimes and misdemeanors, that's one thing. But you're describing a hypothetical in which a member of Congress comes to the conclusion that the president has committed high crimes and misdemeanors, but also predicts that it will redound negatively in the next election. And I think it would not be fulfilling their duty upon their oath to vote in that expedient way that's putting party and self-interest over country and Constitution. With respect to the second question about textualism and historicism, I wasn't around also for the era in which students were taught in the way that you're describing. But if you want to talk about textualism, let's talk about misdemeanors, because it says high crimes and misdemeanors. Now, right now, misusing the logo of the 4-H Club is a misdemeanor. You can look it up. It's a federal misdemeanor. Nobody thinks that's an impeachable offense, right? So the word misdemeanor in the impeachment clause cannot mean what we now think it does. We can look at historical dictionaries to determine what the founders thought, but we can also look at original public meaning as an additional source. And I think that using all of the schools of interpretation is a reasonable approach to understanding this constitutional language, particularly because it's not one that judges in the end are called upon to decide, but rather the political branches. And it's important to note that the Nixon proceeding was the first time that a president was successfully impeached and removed. But it is not the first or only time that we've had other officials impeached and removed. The very first official who was impeached and convicted was in 1804, was a federal judge who was impeached and convicted for high crimes and misdemeanors that were not crimes. It was mishandling cases and drunkenness on the bench. And his defenders argued that he was actually mentally incompetent and couldn't be impeached for that reason, which is an interesting preview and argument that we may see in 2019. But that was rejected by House and Senate. And in fact, over time, over the 200 and almost 30 years, less than a third of the impeachments approved by the House have mentioned the word crime, have listed the elements of any crime. And in fact, the House itself has repeatedly adopted formal reports, on the record, repeating this point that high crimes and misdemeanors need not be crimes. So the word crime obviously is in there in the Constitution, and it obviously means something. But when you look at the history before the founding, that came from England, when you look at the history around the founding, from the generation of people who put that in there, and in the history since then, it's pretty clear that high crimes and misdemeanors certainly can be crimes, but they don't need to.
I just want to add one thing to your question, which is you talked about how you should vote in terms of politically good for your party, but you could ask a more serious question. What about if your vote is going to lead to your own defeat? And I think that was an issue before a number of the members of our committee, the House Judiciary Committee, when they voted for the Nixon impeachment. For me, I came from a Democratic district. But there were 3 Southerners on the committee. You can be sure they had no idea whether they were going to survive this vote politically. That was a very courageous vote for them. I mean, those weren't days of daily polling, 24-hour news. People were very concerned, and we had 7 Republicans on the committee out of, I forget what the number of total was, 19 or so, who voted for impeachment. They didn't know what was going to happen to them in their districts either. So for some of us, it wasn't a matter of courage, but for others, it was a serious matter of courage. And ultimately, it was a question about the Constitution and what does it require. Of course, people read it differently. I think Ron said that very well. But it was a matter of real courage for some people in the committee to do what they felt was constitutionally required.
Hi, you said, I'm Dr. Peter Brennan, PhD in chemistry and quantum mechanics. So I heard you say that Trump has done nothing irreversible or permanent. I don't agree with that at all. He's put 2 people on the Supreme Court which have turned the course of the Supreme Court for our lifetimes, unless we can impeach these 2. I don't want to use a vulgar term. He is denying climate change. The past 2 hurricane seasons have been absolutely devastating. And This is just going to keep on getting worse and worse and worse. Atmospheric levels of carbon dioxide are higher than have ever been found. And Trump wants us to burn coal. He says that using solar power is just ridiculous. We got to burn oil, burn every last drop of oil. What's going to happen when we run out of oil? It's going to happen. It's a matter of when. It's not a matter of if. It's a matter of when. And Trump wants to.
So if you have do you have a question for us?
Okay, why did you say there's been no irreparable damage? Because there has been.
I'm speaking in sort of long-term. Yeah, I agree. Trump is not good for the country, right? But I would say that my point is that there is a key moment in 2020 that is about the redemption of the country through voting. That is historically maybe the crucial thing, the crux, turning point. That is the best case scenario for the country, better than a removal.
Can I actually respond to that? I'd like to make the opposite argument. Presidents in their first term get voted out for any number of reasons. There's an argument that's been put forth by Yascha Mounk, who's a highly respected scholar of authoritarianism. And he argues that the best possible outcome is that Trump is voted out in 2020 as a sound public rejection of his abuses and authoritarianism. And I think that's dangerous for several reasons. One is, who's to say that that's how it would be interpreted? I mean, Jimmy Carter was voted out of office after one term. George H.W. Bush was voted out of office after one term. It could well be that if he's voted out of office after one term and leaves office peacefully, that it will be interpreted as having to do with the economy, which is why most presidents end up leaving after one term, or some mishandling of some foreign policy matter. So we don't know how the public would necessarily perceive that that was the best outcome. It could be that they say, oh, we just need to have another president come in with a stronger economy and the same views. The second thing is, there's a lot of damage that could yet happen in the next 2 years. And, and there's a lot he can do to subvert democracy. And we have to ask yourselves, do you have perfect faith that he won't go to the worst case scenario? It's a little frightening, and sometimes it can seem like Cassandra to raise these worst case scenario questions, but there is a lot more bad that can happen in the next 2 years. And the third point I want to make is that we already have good reason to believe that there was extensive foreign interference in the 2016 election, and there's certainly evidence mounting. Whether or not the president is ultimately criminally charged, certainly people around him were involved in working with foreign operatives to influence the 2016 election. That was when he was a private citizen with very limited powers. Now he's got the presidency. Are we so confident that Trump would not take action to affect the 2020 election if he's in it? Are we so confident that if it's an election that's not completely clear in its result, there's maybe some questions about voting in particular states, and there's some uncertainty about it, that Trump wouldn't take action to dispute it? Are we completely clear that Trump will allow the election to go forward as scheduled? Now, and again, this can seem like Cassandra. There was a recent poll that said 52% of Republicans would support postponing or canceling the 2020 election if the president told them to. So if he's willing to declare a national emergency in a case where there plainly isn't an actual emergency, let's not put it outside the realm of possibility that he might take action to prevent a free and fair election. One thing you can say for an impeachment process, for all of its ups and downs, is that in the end, the vote in the Senate is pretty clear. Nobody's going to argue about how many senators voted which ways, right? But when you have our fragile election system as is, when it could all come down to him charging that votes were rigged against him, claiming that there were undocumented immigrants who were responsible for him losing in certain states, we could be up for a pretty frightening scenario if he is still in office in 2020 when that election comes. And that's why I'm not so quick to say that the best possible outcome is that he lasts the next 2 years in office.
In fact, I'd like to just respond to that too. I completely agree with what Ron has said. Thank you. I completely agree. If you just look at what happened, if this process is aborted, if there is no Mueller report that's issued, first of all, we don't even know what Mueller's going to put in his report. We don't know. He's required in the report to explain why he has declined prosecutions, how much information is he going to put in about why he's declined to prosecute Trump? We don't know. And we also don't know how much Barr is going to release, if he's going to release anything, or whether he's going to redact it. But go back and look at what happened when Richard Nixon resigned the presidency. He resigned the presidency because of the House proceedings. He knew he was going to be impeached by the House overwhelmingly. Maybe there would be 1 or 2 or no more than 10 votes in his favor, and he was going to be removed by the Senate. He was thoroughly disgraced. That was what happened as a result of a proper impeachment proceeding. We don't need a national redemption or some kind of religious result as a, we don't have to go to mea culpa or achet or whatever you say when you want to say I did something wrong. What we need to do is make sure that the evidence against this man is fully gathered, collected, and presented in a coherent way to the American people so that he can be fully and forever disgraced. Otherwise, it's going to be an incomplete record. Who knows what's going to be out there? That's really, really, really important. That's why people have to go. I know it's a little bit hard to go back that far in time. I mean, it's like the Stone Age. I got it. But still, that serves a very important lesson. And the problem is, and it was alluded to too, and I want to just mention this again and repeat it. We had the benefit. The House Judiciary Committee didn't have to do all the work. Luckily, thank goodness, because you can see Congress isn't set up to do this kind of thing. We had the Senate Watergate hearings. They educated the American people. All the top Nixon henchmen were called before that committee. American people could understand what was going on. They heard Dean testify. It was a vital educational process. They also had a roadmap from the grand jury, which was given to us in the middle of our process in March. That hasn't happened from Mueller. Why hasn't? No one's really asked. Why hasn't he gone to the grand jury to ask them to provide what they've found to the Congress for their consideration? Everyone's waiting for his report, but there's something else he could do, maybe more important than a report, is to get the report from the grand jury, because in his report he may not be able to include grand jury material. So there's stuff that really needs to be done now, but the critical thing is that Congress now, because it had no set in Watergate committee to hold hearings, and because they have to do the hearings and the fact-finding that hasn't been done for the past 2 years. There's been a Republican cover-up for the past 2 years.
But we have a lot more questions. Okay.
Sorry.
So let's take 3 questions together because we have about 5 minutes. I'll bring the microphone over here. Sorry, I'm going to bring it over here. Let's take 3 questions. Great, thank you.
I want this.
That's what we were going to.
Shugerman, I'm curious how you reconcile the recent House election and whether or not we need 2020 to be a referendum if we had like a significant changing of the guard there.
Let's take a couple more questions. Great. Oh, yes. One here and then one. Oh, sure. Go ahead.
Having lived, being one of those old people who lived through Nixon and that kind of stuff, and it would be wonderful if what you were, if what you're suggesting could happen, but in this internet age and in the kind of degrading the media and false facts, do we stand a chance of having McConnell? I mean, let's not forget who's in the Senate and what they march in lockstep to. Do we have a chance of having the process that happened with Nixon to be a free and fair and open, non-tweeted kind of a process ever in this country again? And that's the thing that's frightening. And I think that's why people are saying if the election throws him out, it's good. But if we start this process, it's only going to get even uglier. We're much more polarized even now, I think, than we were then.
Great.
My question was actually fairly similar, which was just that in terms of the impeachment hearings being a great education for during the Nixon administration, I'm curious to
Not
what
the impeachment hearings.
Oh, I'm sorry, the-
Senate Watergate committee hearings. They were not impeachment, specifically not impeachment.
but they were still broadcast to only 4 TV stations and 3 newspapers. And I'm wondering if you think that any of that would be different now, kind of relating to the previous question, to do with the fact that you can get your news from hundreds of places and the news cycles last 15 or 20 minutes now instead of weeks.
Sorry, we'll take those 3, and then we'll see if there's time for more. Quickly, I think part of the point about the Watergate hearings that they didn't have to be framed as impeachment hearings. They were Watergate fact-finding hearings, and I think part of the solution, just to deal with the problem of the modern social media age, is that Mueller's report will be one place that everyone will have to engage with. It'll be a common text that it will be spun in lots of different directions, but it's a common starting point of some key facts that we're all waiting for. There are things that Mueller knows that we need to find out before we can go to the next step, and it will be a bit of a corrective for the Fox News era of hyperspin for one bubble. And we have, there are bubbles all across the board. On the point about different elections, the 2018 election was very significant, right? The House won, the Democrats won the House. But it's also important to recognize that it was a split verdict, right? The Republicans won more seats in the Senate. Now, it was heavily stacked in their favor. I was very disappointed by that result. But I think it's key to look at, this is not a country that has dramatically moved into Nixon territory. Trump, to my horror, to my absolute horror, reflective of what you're saying about, we're in a country where there's a substantial fascist kind of base, right? It's important to recognize what fascism is. And we have, we have to state it now. Is the correction for fascism to push forward as fast as possible solutions? I think one remedy for fascism is to actually be very careful and try and persuade moderates about what the dangers are so that they can perceive them. And I think we need Mueller's report to be able to convince people in the middle that there is a fascist danger in the country. Well, I want to make sure that we have a chance to respond to the other questions.
I just want to say one little thing that partially responds to several of those questions. I've looked at the polling history from 1973 and 74 of support for impeachment of Nixon. And it was in the low 20s for most of 1973. It rose into the 30s. And then as the impeachment inquiry actually began in October 1973, it remained in the 30s, maybe the 40s for a while. It didn't cross 50% until after the Judiciary Committee already approved articles of impeachment. Where it was in the October of 73, when the House Judiciary Committee started its impeachment inquiry, was in the 30s, well below public support for impeaching Trump as of today. So depending on which poll you look at, it does vary. Support for impeaching Trump is in the low to mid 40s right now. It has never, except briefly in one poll, crossed 50%, but it's always hovered in the low to mid 40s. I think 46% was the most recent poll that I saw. That is way higher than public support for impeaching Nixon was until the very end of the process. So although we don't have the benefit of having had a long history with the Senate Watergate Committee, we do have the benefit that in 1973, in May, when the Senate Watergate Committee started its proceedings, a lot of people reasonably thought that the president had legitimately done nothing wrong associated with Watergate. And the question, what did the president know and when did he know it, was actually offered by someone who thought that Nixon was actually completely innocent. We're not there. We already have a substantial fraction of the public that's ready to move on this. So I think we're a little behind in some ways, but we're actually considerably ahead in others.
So we are, why don't you take the last word? Yes, go ahead.
Okay, maybe you can hear me.
Yeah.
I think that two questions or the three questions kind of merge or converge, because in the end, there's not going to be an impeachment in the House, nor will there be a conviction, certainly not in the Senate, unless there's public support. The public support is key. It's the American people that force Congress to act, and it's the American people that can make the Senate act. And the fact that you have all these different fractionated ways of getting news is not necessarily, doesn't mean that people don't understand what's going on. I mean, most Americans know there's a national emergency. We have a number of Republicans who've already said they're opposed to supporting it, and more may come out later. The same happened with regard to the issue of the shutdown. Yeah, everybody gets news from Fox News, but Fox News also had to report a shutdown. And so, you know, some of this stuff will get out to everybody. The problem right now is that there's a welter of facts. Every day there's a new allegation that could potentially be an impeachable offense. Nobody's put it, the Congress hasn't yet put it into a narrative, into a framework that people can understand. What does this, all this bad stuff mean? Is this a grounds for impeachment? And if so, why? That's why it's really important for these hearings to be held to get the additional facts, but also, if you start an impeachment inquiry, to begin to put this all into some kind of framework so the American people can understand it. I have a framework that I, by the way, mention in my book, which is called The Case for Impeaching Trump, which you can get out there as well. But so I don't despair about the Senate, and I think that the framers of the Constitution understood the damage a president could do. They gave us impeachment, and we need to make sure that we don't just cast it aside without looking at it thoroughly, seeing whether we can put the evidence together, and if that's the case, moving forward. I don't see the danger, except if we do it in a completely partisan partisan way without having the evidence to back us up.
Great. Well, please join me in thanking Congresswoman Holtzman and Mr. Fein for this conversation.
Thank you.
We're happy to stick around for your comments. Great. Thank you so much.